Book 5. While Perseus, Danae's son, was telling his story before the assembled Ethiopian chiefs, a noisy commotion broke out in the royal halls. It was not the convivial cheering that graces a wedding feast, but the clamor which augurs a riot. A banquet that suddenly turns to a brawl might well be compared to a calm sea rudely disturbed by a violent, howling gale, which has made it exceedingly rough and lashed the waves to a fury. Leading the riot was Cepheus's brother Phineus, who rashly started a fight as he brandished his bronze-tipped ashen spear. "Look," he shouted to Perseus, "I've come to avenge the theft of my bride. You won't be saved by your wings or by Jupiter changing himself into counterfeit gold." As he aimed his weapon, Cepheus cried to his brother, "What are you doing? What crazy notion is goading you into a crime? Is this the reward to be offered for such great service, the dowry you pay for Andromeda's rescue? To tell you the truth, it wasn't Perseus who took her away from you. No, you must blame the Nereid's anger, the horned god Ammon, the monster who rose from the sea to sate its ravening jaws on the fruit of my own loins. That was the time when you lost her, the time when death was about to take her away. Unless, cruel brute, her death is what you're demanding, and only our grief can console you. It wasn't enough, I suppose, that you saw her chained to the cliff and proffered no help, though you were her uncle and promised husband. To make matters worse, when someone has freed her, you have to resent it and venture to steal the reward. If it matters so much to you now, why didn't you fetch her away from the rocks to which she was pinioned? The prize has gone to a hero who saved an old father from losing his daughter. Allow him to take what I promised and what he's deserved. Do realize we didn't prefer him to you, but to certain death." Phineus said not a word, but glared at his brother and Perseus in turn, uncertain which of the two he should aim to kill. After a brief hesitation, he hurled his spear with all the power that his anger could lend him at Perseus, but missed his target. The weapon was caught in the cushions. Perseus at last leapt up from his seat and savagely flung the spear back. Indeed, he'd have pierced his opponent's heart if the villainous Phineus hadn't escaped to the back of the altar and shamefully taken sanctuary there. But the spear wasn't thrown in vain. It lodged in the forehead of Rhoetus, who fell to the ground. When the point was wrenched from his skull, his feet jerked out, and the food on the banqueting table was spattered with blood. Now furious passions rose in the crowd and tempers were blazing. Weapons began to fly. There were some who argued that Cepheus deserved to die with his daughter's bridegroom, but Cepheus already had left the palace, invoking the names of justice, faith, and the gods of the hearth to protest that the riot was none of his making. Minerva, the warrior goddess, arrived to encourage Perseus and give her brother protection behind her impregnable aegis. Among the throng was an Indian youth called Athos. Limnaea, the Ganges' daughter, is thought to have given him birth in the crystal waves of the river. His wonderfully handsome looks were enhanced by his elegant clothes. Still a pure and innocent boy of 16, he was dressed in a cloak of Tyrian purple, trimmed with a golden border. His neck was adorned with a delicate golden chain, while his hair was scented with myrrh and held in place by a circlet. Athos had mastered the skills of throwing the javelin at targets however remote, but his gifts as an archer were even greater. On this occasion his hand was bending his pliant bow when Perseus, seizing a smoking brand from the altar, struck him across the face, which was smashed to pulp as the bones were shattered. Assyrian Lycabas, Athos's most intimate friend, who had never concealed the truth of the love that he felt for him, saw the features he'd fondly worshipped emblazoned in blood. In a passion of grief for the youth who had suffered such cruel hurt and was gasping his life out, he snatched the bow which Athos had aimed and shouted to Perseus, Your fight must now be with me. You shan't be gloating for long over killing a boy whose murder has won you more hatred than glory." Before he had finished, his sharp-tipped bow was shot from the string, but Perseus ducked and it merely caught in the folds of his tunic. Quickly, Acrisius's grandson drew his sickle-shaped sword, well tried in the blood of Medusa, and slashed his challenger's chest. As Lycabas's swimming eyes grew blurred in the darkness of death, he looked all around for his Athos and fell at the poor youth's side. They had died together, and that was the comfort he took to the underworld. There, Cyanean Phorbas, the son of Medion, rushing forward with Libyan Amphimedon, eager to join in the fighting. Both slipped and fell in the pool of blood still warmed on the earth. As they tried to pick themselves up, they encountered Perseus's sword, Amphimedon in the ribs and Phorbas across his throat. Aratus, son of Actor, however, was armed with a great, broad, double-edged axe. To stand against him, our hero discarded his hook-shaped sword and instead grabbed hold of a massive bowl, embossed by its craftsman in high relief and enormously weighty. Lifting it up in both hands, he dashed it down on his victim, who vomited blood in a gush as he fell on his back and pounded the earth with his head. Polydegmon, scion of Queen Semiramis' house, was next to be laid on the ground. Then Abaris, born in the Caucasus Mountains, Lycidas, who lived by the river Spercheius, Helices, always with hair unshorn, and Clitus with Phlegius. Perseus was trampling on piles of the dying mounting in front of him. Phineus lacked the courage to brave his foe at close quarters, but hurled his javelin, which went astray and fell upon Idas, who'd tried in vain to keep out of the fray and had stayed impartial. Gazing with angry eyes on his cruel assailant, Idas said to him, "Phineus, since I am forced to take sides, you must now accept the foe you have made and pay for a blow with a blow." Then drawing the spear from his body, he struggled to throw it back, but his limbs were drained of their blood, and he quickly collapsed on the ground. Then also Hodates, next in rank to the king of the Cephanes, fell to Clemenus' sword. Prothoenor was slaughtered by Hypsias, whom Perseus slaughtered in turn. Among the crowd was an elder, Amathion, known for his love of justice and fear of the gods. His years prevented him fighting, so words had to serve him for weapons. Striding forward, he cursed and denounced the impious brawl, then knelt by the altar. His trembling hands were clutching at its sides, when Chromis cut off his head. It toppled straight on the slab, and there a half-living tongue continued to utter its curses, until all life was exhausted and finally lost in the flames. Next, a pair of twin brothers, Ammon and Brodius, boxers and champions unbeaten, if swords could be beaten by boxing thongs, were struck to the ground by the hand of Phineus. So was Ampicus, priest of Ceres, although he was wearing his white wool headband. Lampetides also was killed, who wasn't there for the fighting, but merely the peaceful purpose of playing the lyre and performing the joyful songs he'd been ordered to sing at the wedding feast. He was standing apart, with only his harmless plectrum in hand, when Pedalus mockingly cried, "You can sing the rest of your songs to the shades of the Styx," and he plunged his sword in the bard's left temple. Lampetides fell. His dying fingers fumbled back to the strings, and, in tune with his fall, struck up a dejected lament. Lycormas, furious, wouldn't allow the minstrel to die unavenged. He wrenched the stout wood bar from the right-hand doorpost, crashed it down on the nape of Pedalus's neck, and laid him flat on the ground like a sacrificed bullock. Cyniphian Peletes tried to remove the other bar from the left-hand post, but before he could do it, his hand was pierced by the Carthaginian Corythus's spear and pinned to the wood. As he helplessly clung there, Abas wounded him through the side, unable to fall. He hung from the post where his hand was nailed until he expired. Death came also to Melanius, one of Perseus's supporters, and Dorylus, known as the wealthiest man in the whole of Libya. Dorylus, rich in land, whose estates of cornfields and mounting heaps of imported incense were larger than anyone else's. Rich as he was struck by a javelin thrown from the side in the groin, that sensitive place. When Bactrian Halcyonius, who had thrown the weapon, could see him rolling his eyes in pain and gasping his last, he said, Of all your acres of land, you may keep the patch where you're lying, and left the body to rot there. But soon he was punished by Perseus, who wrested the spear from the still warm wound and flung it towards him. Landing on top of the Bactrian's nose, the shaft emerged through his neck and protruded on each side. While fortune favored the hand of Perseus, he murdered Clanus and Clytius, born of the selfsame mother but differently wounded. Clytius's thighs were skewered by Perseus's powerfully brandished spear of ash, while Clanus's teeth had to bite on a javelin. Celadon also was killed. He was born by the Nile in Mendes, and Astrius, child of a Palestine whore by an unknown father. Aethon perished, who once was deeply versed in clairvoyance, but then had badly mistaken the omens. Thoactes, the royal armor-bearer, and lastly, Agurdes, the infamous parricide. Perseus was weary, but more was to come since he was alone, and the rest were determined to crush him. The milling throng had united, sworn to fight in a cause that opposed all merit and good faith. His only backers were Cepheus, whose loyalty counted for little, along with the bride and her mother, who filled the hall with their screaming, drowned though it was by the clashing of arms and the groans of the dying. Meanwhile, the goddess of war polluted the household gods and drenched them in rivers of blood, as she caused fresh strife and confusion. Now Phineus and all of 1,000 supporters were there in a ring, surrounding Perseus alone. Their arrows were flying past him, thicker than hailstones, to either side, by his eyes and his ears. He stood with his back to a great stone pillar to cover his rear, then faced the crowd as they pressed towards him, and held them off. Chaonian Mulpius was close to his left. To his right was Arabian Achaemon. Think of a tigress, goaded to madness by hunger, who hears 2 herds of cattle lowing in separate valleys. She cannot decide which herd to attack, but is longing to pounce on both of them. So Perseus, was he to strike to the right or the left? In the end, he disposed of Mulpius by wounding him through the shin and letting him flee, since Achaemon allowed him no further time and was frantically trying to drive his sword through the enemy's throat. But his powerful thrust was clumsily aimed. The blade of his weapon struck the edge of the pillar and shattered. A flying splinter of metal lodged in Achaemon's throat, but it wasn't sufficient to cause his death. While he stood there trembling, vainly outstretching his weaponless hands, the hero dispatched him with Mercury's hooked sword. When Perseus saw that the crowd was more than his courage could handle, he cried to them all, "Since you yourselves are forcing me to it, I'll now seek help from my foe. If I've any friends here, I advise them to turn their faces away." And he brandished the head of the Gorgon. "Find another to scare with your riddles," Thescylus answered, but just as he started to cast his deadly javelin, his body froze like a statue in throwing position. The next to challenge Perseus the Lionheart was Ampyx, who thrust his sword at the hero's breast. As he did it, his right hand stiffened, unable to move either forward or back. Then Neleus, who'd falsely claimed to be sprung from the Nile with its 7 mouths, and whose shield was embossed with 7 rivers in silver and gold, called out to him, "Perseus, look at my family's founder. To have such a hero as me for your killer must surely console you amongst the voiceless shades." But his final words were cut off as he said them. To judge by his open lips, you'd suppose that he wanted to speak, but the sounds couldn't find a way through. These 3 were taunted by Eryx. "It isn't the power of the Gorgon that's making you numb, but your feeble courage. Now join me in charging this youth as he toys with his magic weapons, and laying him flat." The charge was about to begin when his feet stuck fast to the earth, and he stayed, a motionless rock in the lasting form of an armed man. These deserved to be punished, but one called Acontius, a soldier on Perseus's side, set eyes on the Gorgon during the fight, and his body grew firm and hard as the stone crept over his frame. Astyages, thinking the fellow was still alive, struck out with his sword's full length, but all it produced was an echoing clang. As he stood where he was, dumbfounded, he turned into stone himself, with a face which preserved his expression of wonder in marble forever. You'd find it tedious to learn the names of the rank and file involved in the fray. 200 bodies survived the battle, another 200 were turned to stone at the sight of the Gorgon. Phineus at last regretted the riot he'd caused so unfairly, but what could he do? As his eyes traveled round the different statues, he recognized his own friends and cried to each one by his name, appealing for help. In disbelief, he fingered the forms that were nearest, and all were marble. Turning away and admitting defeat, he extended his arms sideways in a plea for mercy. "You win, Perseus," he said. "Put away your monster. Remove your Medusa, whoever she is, with the stare which turns us to stone. Please take it away. It wasn't personal hate or kingly ambition which drove me to start the fighting. I simply wanted my bride. You surely deserve to win her, but I was betrothed to her first. I yield to you gladly. Only allow me, most valiant of heroes, to keep my miserable life, and all the rest can be yours." He spoke without daring to look at the man he was begging to spare him. Then Perseus gave him his answer. "Phineus, you spineless coward, no need to be scared. I'll allow you all that I can. A handsome gift for a weakling like you. You shan't be put to the sword, man. No, I shall make you a lasting memorial for all posterity. You'll be on permanent view in the house of my father-in-law, that my wife may console herself with her former intended's likeness." With that, he quickly carried Medusa across to display her where Phineus had turned his quivering head. As the cowering villain attempted to shift his eyes away once again, his neck grew stiff, and the tears running down his cheeks were hardened to stone. But still a coward's face and the suppliant's look were preserved in marble, along with the pleading hands and the cringing posture. Perseus returned with his wife to his native city in triumph. Once there, he avenged and championed his grandfather, not that the old man greatly deserved it, by challenging Proetus, who'd ousted his brother by force of arms and taken control of Acrisius's fortress. This time, not force of arms nor the fortress he'd seized could enable Proetus to counter the terrible eyes of the snake-wreathed Gorgon. Polydectes, however, who ruled the tiny island of Seriphos, failed to be moved by the dangers that Perseus had faced and the courage he'd shown in so many exploits. He still held on to his stubborn, relentless hatred and never ceased from his unjust anger. He even belittled the hero's glory and claimed that Medusa's death was a fiction. "Here is the proof that my story is true," cried Perseus to all. "Watch out for your eyes." And the face of the king was turned at once into bloodless stone by the face of Medusa. Minerva supported her brother, born in the shower of gold, throughout these trials. But now she wrapped herself in a hollow cloud and departed from Seriphos. Cynthos and Gyaros lay to her right. Then, finding the shortest crossing over the sea, she made for Thebes and the mountain of Helicon, home of the Muses. Here she landed and spoke to the sisters who govern the arts. "A rumor has come to my ears of a fountain that started to gush when the earth was struck by the hoof of the winged horse sprung from Medusa. Hence my arrival. I wanted to see this amazing spring, as I witnessed the horse's birth from the blood of his Gorgon mother." Urania answered, "Whatever your reason for coming to visit us here in our home, kind goddess, we feel great pleasure. The story you've heard is correct. The winged horse Pegasus started our spring." And she took Minerva down to the sacred fountain. Slowly admiring the waters which Pegasus's hoof had created, the goddess surveyed the clusters of grand primeval trees, mysterious caves, and grass bejeweled with myriads of flowers. She declared that Memory's daughters were truly blessed in their dwelling, as well as the arts they ruled. Then one of the sisters addressed her. "Minerva, goddess who fitly could join our musical company, had not your own fine qualities marked you out for yet greater tasks, your praise of our arts and our home is truly deserved. Ours is a happy lot, if we could but be sure of our safety. Sadly, the hearts of the virgin muses are constantly anxious. Crime these days has no bars. The image of wicked Perennius is always in front of my eyes, and the shock has not left me completely. That savage tyrant was occupying Daulis and Phocus lands he'd unjustly seized with the aid of his Thracian soldiers, and we were traveling through to our temple on Mount Parnassus. He saw us coming, and smiling as though he respected our godhead, said to us, "Memory's daughters," he knew who we were, "please rest here. You mustn't refuse to shelter under my roof in this shocking downpour." The weather was dreadful. The gods have often been seen in humbler abodes than mine. So, swayed by his words and the storm, we accepted his invitation and entered the hall of his palace. Later, the rain subsided, the wind had changed to the north, and the murky clouds were scudding away in a clearing sky. As we made a move to depart, Perseus bolted the doors and tried to assault us, but we escaped him by taking wing. As though he intended to follow, the king climbed up to the battlements, shouting, "Whichever pathway you take, I'll find it and follow." Quite out of his wits, he cast himself from the top of the tower and fell face forward down to the ground. He shattered his skull and stained the earth with his impious blood as he crashed to his death. The Muse was speaking, when suddenly through the air there resounded a whirring of wings, and voices of greeting were heard from the treetops. Minerva looked up and asked whose tongues could possibly have spoken so clearly, supposing the sounds proceeded from human lips. But they came from birds. There were 9 of them, roosting up in the branches, all bemoaning their fates. They were magpies, wonderful mimics. The Muse replied to the puzzled goddess, "Those creatures up there have recently joined the mass of the birds after losing a contest. Pierus was their father, a rich landowner in Pella, their mother Calliope, who came from Paeonia. 9 hard times she'd gone into labor and called on Lucina, the goddess of childbirth. Puffed in the pride of their numbers, this rabble of ignorant sisters traveled throughout all the towns of Haemonia and all of Achaia, here to Parnassus, and then presented the following challenge. Cease to deceive the uncultured mob with your empty attractions. If you believe in your musical gifts, Heliconian muses, you'll surely agree to compete with us. We say that our voices are finer, our skill is more expert. What's more, we match you in number. If we are the winners, you'll yield us your 2 Boeotian fountains. If not, then we will surrender our home in Amathia's plains as far as Paeonia's snow hills. The nymphs can adjudge between us." Shame as it was to compete with these girls, we thought it was even more shaming to bow to their claim. The nymphs who were chosen as jury swore by their streams to judge fairly and took their places on benches formed from the natural rock. Without any casting of lots, the Pierid maiden who'd first presented the challenge began. Her song was about war in the sky. She ascribed to the giants a glory undue and belittled the deeds of the mighty gods. The monstrous Typhon, sprung from the deepest bowels of the earth, had struck such fear in the heaven dwellers that all in a body were put to flight, until in exhaustion they found a refuge in Egypt, close to the banks of the Nile with its 7 mouths. She told how the earth-born giant had followed them even there, so forcing the gods to conceal themselves under alien guises. Jupiter, said the maiden, became a ram, which accounts for Libyan Ammon's representation in modern times, with his curving horns. Apollo lurked in the shape of a crow, Bacchus a goat, Diana a cat, and Juno a snow-white cow, while Venus appeared as a fish and Mercury an ibis. Such was the song which the Pereid sang as she played on her lyre. We muses were called upon to respond, but perhaps you haven't the time or the leisure to lend an ear to our own performance. "I've plenty of time," Minerva replied as she took her seat in the shade of the forest. "Now sing me your song from beginning to end." The Muse continued. "Our cause was entrusted to one of our band, Calliope. She, with her flowing hair and an ivy wreath, rose up and strummed a few plungent chords to test her lyre strings, then firmly plucked them to launch at once on the following lay. My song is of Ceres, first to furrow the soil with the plowshare, first to give corn to the earth and nourishing food to mankind, first to give laws. All things are the gift of bountiful Ceres. She is my theme. I pray that my song may prove to be worthy of this great goddess. Surely the goddess is worthy of song. The enormous island of Sicily lies heaped high on the limbs of the giant Typhon, who dared to aspire to a throne in the heavens. Often the monster strains and struggles to rise from his prison, but Cape Pelorus, closest to Italy, weighs on his right hand, Pachynus on his left, while his legs are crushed beneath Lilybaeum. Etna presses on Typhon's head, laid out on his back. He belches lava and vomits flame from the angry volcano. Often he fights to shift the earth which is forcing him down, and to roll the cities and massive mountains away from his body. The earth then goes into tremor, and even the king of the shades is afraid that the crust of the earth will crack and a chasm be opened to let in the daylight and frighten the quivering spirits below. It was fear of such a disaster that prompted the monarch of Hades to rise from his gloomy realm. In his chariot drawn by black horses, he toured around Sicily, carefully inspecting the island's foundations. Once he'd assured himself that nothing was giving way and his fears were dispelled, he was sighted wandering hither and yon by Venus enthroned on her fountain of Eryx. Fondly embracing her winged son, Cupid, she said to him, "You, dear child, are my weapons, my hands and the source of my power. Now take your invincible shafts and shoot those swift-flying arrows to pierce the heart of the god, whom fortune allotted the final share in the world's 3 kingdoms. You can subdue the gods of the sky and even Jove. It is you who vanquish the sea gods, including their sovereign Neptune. Why should the underworld lag behind? And why not extend the empire of Venus and Cupid? A third of the world is at stake. As it is, we are losing respect in heaven because we have been too soft. Your power and prestige are diminished along with my own. You can see that Minerva and also the goddess of hunting Diana have firmly rejected me. So will the virgin daughter of Ceres if we allow it to happen. Her hopes are the same as the others. Now, in the name of the power we share, if you take any pride in it, make that goddess her uncle's wife." So Venus commanded. Cupid opened his quiver. Next, at his mother's bidding, he chose from his 1,000 arrows a single one, but the sharpest and surest he had, the shaft which responded best to his bow. Then resting his pliant weapon against his knee, he bent it, shot the barbed reed and wounded dusky Dis in the heart. Not far from the walls of Sicilian Henna, you'll come to a deep lake, Pergus by name. It is haunted by swans. You won't hear more of them singing along the gliding streams of the river Caister. The water is wreathed all around by a garland of forest where foliage offers an awning against the burning rays of the sun. The branches provide a delightful coolness, the well-watered soil is a flowery carpet of Tyrian purple, and spring is eternal. One day, Proserpina, Ceres' daughter, was there in the woodland, happily plucking bunches of violets or pure white lilies, filing the folds of her dress or her basket in girlish excitement, vying to pick more flowers than her friends, when Pluto espied her. No sooner espied than he loved her and swept her away. So impatient in passion is passion. In panic, Proserpina desperately cried for her mother and friends, more often her mother. Her dress had been torn at the top, and all the flowers she had picked fell out of her loosened tunic, which only served to increase her distress, poor innocent girl. Her abductor was off in his chariot, urging the horses forward, each by his name, and shaking the rust-dyed reins of their long-maned necks. They galloped across deep lakes and the pools of Pelissa, reeking with sulfur and boiling up through a crack of the earth, to Syracuse, where the Bacchiadae from the Isthmus of Corinth had built a new city between 2 harbors, the great and the smaller. Syracuse boasts 2 springs, Arethusa and Cyane, either side of a bay that is almost enclosed by narrow promontories. This was the place where Cyane lived, most famous of all the Sicilian nymphs, who also gave her name to the fountain. She rose from the midst of her pool as far as her waist and recognized whom the god was abducting. "Halt where you are," she cried. "You cannot take Ceres' daughter without her mother's permission. You ought to have asked for her hand, not stolen her. I was loved, if I may compare the small to the great, by the river Anapus, but I was won not by terror like her, but by prayer and entreaties." So speaking, Cyane stretched her arms to the right and the left and barred the way forward. Containing his anger no longer, Pluto roared at his fearsome steeds, then brandished his royal scepter, with all the strength of his arm and hurled it into the depths of the pool. As it struck the bottom, it opened a tunnel to Hades. Cyane, deeply distressed by the goddess's abduction and also the trespass against her spring, felt inconsolably hurt. She brooded in silence and wasted away in her tears to nothing, dissolving into the water she'd lately ruled as its guardian spirit. Her limbs grew sodden, her bones started to bend, her nails let go of their firmness. First to melt were her slightest features, the dark green hair, the fingers, the legs, and the feet. It doesn't take long for the slenderer members to change into waves of chilly liquid. The next to go were her shoulders and back, her sides and her breasts, as they vanished away into insubstantial rivulets. Nothing solid remained when lastly the lifeblood coursing her weakened veins was taken over by water. Meanwhile, Proserpina's mother anxiously searched for her daughter over the world, by land and by ocean, but all to no purpose. Neither the dewy dawn nor the evening star ever found her at rest. She lit 2 torches of pine in Etna's volcano, and bore them in either hand to illumine her sleepless way through the darkness of frosty night. When the stars were dimmed by the kindly day, she continued the quest for her child from west to east. Tired by her journey, she wanted to drink and hadn't yet moistened her lips at a spring, when she happened to notice a straw-roofed cottage, and knocked on its humble door. Out came an old woman who looked at the goddess, and when she had asked for some water, provided a sweet brew sprinkled with toasted barley. As Ceres drank what she gave her, an insolent, coarse-looking boy strolled up in front of the goddess, burst into laughter, and jeered, "What a greedy female you are!" Deeply insulted, she rapidly threw what was left of her drink in the prattling idiot's face and drenched him in barley mixture. His soaking cheeks were instantly covered in spots, and his arms were transformed into legs. As his body changed, it acquired a tail and shrank to a tiny size which made it comparatively harmless, shorter in length than the smallest lizard. Bewildered and weeping, the poor old woman attempted to catch this extraordinary thing, but it scampered away into hiding. The name that we give it derives from the patterning found on its skin. We call it the star-speckled newt. Listing the lands and the seas where the goddess went on her travels would take too long. No countries were left for her to explore. At last she returned to Sicily. There, in the course of her wanderings, she came to Cyane's pool. If the nymph had not been transformed, she'd have told the whole story. But much as she wanted to tell it, her lips and her tongue were gone, and she had no means of expression. Evidence, though, could be pointed out. Proserpina's girdle, well known to her mother, had accidentally dropped into Cyane's sacred pool and still lay floating on top of the water. Once she recognized this, as if the truth of her daughter's abduction had dawned on the goddess at last, she wildly tore her unkempt hair and beat on her breasts again and again. She still did not know where Proserpina was, but she cursed every region on earth as ungrateful and ill-deserving her gift of the crops. Sicily most of all, where she'd finally found the traces of what she had lost. And so she savagely wrecked the plows that furrowed the soil in Sicily's fields. Her bitterness drove her to slaughter the cattle and farmers alike. She instructed the fields to default on the dues that they owed, and blighted the fruits of the earth. Sicily's worldwide fame as a fertile country was ruined and given the lie. As the first shoot sprang from the earth, they would perish at once, destroyed by the scorching sunshine or torrents of rain. Stars and the winds had a baleful influence. Birds would greedily gobble the seed as it fell on the soil, while the harvest of wheat was choked by the thistles and tares and the indestructible twitchgrass. Then the nymph whom the river Alpheus had loved, Arethusa, raised her head from her waters, and brushing her streaming locks away from her forehead, she said, "Earth Mother, you've searched for your maiden daughter throughout the world. Abandon the endless struggle, and calm your anger against the land which has served you so faithfully. Sicily's free from blame. She wasn't happy to witness your child's abduction. It's not for my native country I'm pleading, as I'm a foreigner here. I was born at Pisa at Elis. But Sicily is the land that I cherish above all others, the land that I look on as home. Kind goddess, have mercy and save it." The story of why I left Elis and crossed such a large expanse of ocean to Syracuse here, I shall tell in a timelier hour, when you are relieved of your troubles and able to smile again. This much must suffice for now. The earth opened up to afford me a way, and I was conveyed underneath its bottommost caverns, until my head rose, and I saw the stars I had missed for so long. Then, while I was gliding under the earth in the flood of the Styx, I chanced to set eyes down there on your own lost daughter Proserpina. Sad she appeared, to be sure, and the fear still showed on her face, but yet she's the queen, the most powerful lady in all the underworld, consort supreme to the sovereign lord of the regions infernal. Hearing these words, Proserpina's mother was long dumbfounded, as though she were stone or struck by thunder, but when the force of her shock was dispelled by the strength of her grief, she drove her chariot straight to the realms of the sky. With a countenance clouded with fury, her hair let loose, exuding malice, she stood before Jupiter, telling him firmly, "I've come to plead for my flesh and blood, great Jupiter, mine and your own. If her mother merits no favors, at least be moved as a father, and don't think any the less of your child, I beg you, because she was brought into being by me. Now look, the daughter I searched for so long has at last been found, if finding means more certainly losing or merely discovering where she is. I'm willing to bear her abduction so long as he gives her back. A bandit husband is hardly a match for a daughter of yours, if she is no longer a daughter of mine." Jupiter answered, "Your child remains a pledge of our bond and a charge that I share with you. But please use words which accord with the facts of the case. Lord Pluto hasn't committed a crime, but an act of love. No need for us to feel shame at the marriage if only you will accept it, Ceres. Setting aside all other advantages, Pluto is Jupiter's brother no less. And what of the rest? He and I were allotted different kingdoms, but otherwise we are equals. Still, if you're so concerned to see them divorce, Proserpina shall be restored to the heavens on one condition. No morsel of food must have touched her lips while she stayed in Hades. These are the terms decreed by the three fates." Jupiter made his point, but Ceres was still determined to have Proserpina back. The fates, alas, were against it. The girl had already broken her fast. While taking an innocent stroll in the orchard, she'd plucked a crimson fruit from a hanging bough, then peeling off the yellowish rind, she had picked out 7 pomegranate seeds and crunched them between her teeth. No one at all observed her eating except for one, Ascalaphus, son of Orphne, a well-known nymph in Avernus. She's said to have borne him in Hell's dark woods to her lover Acheron. Seeing, he turned informer and cruelly prevented Proserpina's homeward return. The Queen of Erebus wailed in distress and transformed the telltale witness into a bird of ill omen. Sprinkling his hateful face with a handful of phlegethon water, she turned it into a beak with feathers and a great round eyes. Removed from his former self, he was mantled in tawny wings. His body grew into his head, and his nails into long hooked talons. Scarcely ruffling the plumage which lay on his motionless arms, he was changed to an odious bird, the prophet of doom and sorrow, the indolent screech owl, a dreadful portent to all mankind. Ascalaphus surely deserved the reward that he won for his tattling, but strange to tell, Achelous' daughters, the sirens, were given the feet and feathers of birds, though they kept the faces of girls. How so? Perhaps these maidens, renowned for their prowess in singing, were there with Proserpina while she was picking her springtime flowers. After they'd searched in vain for their mistress throughout the world, in order to show the sea how deeply they felt their bereavement, they prayed for the power to cross the waves on wings for their oars. The gods were kind, and the suppliants suddenly found that their limbs were covered with golden plumage. But lest their beguilingly soothing singing should die, and so much musical talent be wasted, the sirens retained their maiden faces and human voices. Jupiter settled the conflict between his brother and grieving sister by splitting the rolling year into equal parts. Proserpina now, as the only divinity common to both realms, spends 6 months on the earth with her mother and 6 with her husband. Once she returns, her heart is so light and her face is so happy. A moment ago she'd have struck even Pluto as sad, but now she is glowing with radiant smiles, like the sun which was formerly hidden behind a blanket of rain clouds and then emerges victorious. Now that her daughter was safely recovered, bountiful Ceres was tranquil enough to ask Arethusa why she had fled from her birthplace and how she'd been changed to a sacred fountain. The waves fell still as the goddess rose from the depths of her pool. Then, wiping the water away from her dark green locks, she began the tale of how she had once attracted Alpheus, the river of Elis. "I was one of the nymphs," she said, "whose home is Achaia. None was more active than I in scouring the forest glades or spreading the hunting nets. But although I never set out to be famed for my beauty, brave as I was always known as that beautiful girl Arethusa. The praises rained on my comely person gave me no pleasure. Where others are proud of their bodies, I blushed like a rustic and thought it a crime to be seen as attractive. One day, I recall, I was traveling back from Stymphalus's forest. The heat was doubly oppressive as hunting had made me exhausted. I came on a stream which was perfectly still and perfectly silent, transparent down to the bed. You could count each one of the pebbles. You'd never believe it was flowing. Silvery willows and water-fed poplars provided a natural shade for the sloping banks. I approached the brink and, to start with, put my feet in the water, then waded in up to my knees. It wasn't enough. Untying my girdle and tossing my soft clothes onto the branch of a willow, I plunged in totally naked. And while I was wildly thrashing and flailing around with my outflung arms in the folds of the river, I suddenly heard, deep down in the stream, a peculiar murmur. Startled, I made for the nearer bank and jumped out quickly. "Where are you going so fast, Arethusa?" The voice of Alpheus came from his waters. "Where are you going?" he hoarsely repeated. Just as I was, completely undressed, as my clothes had been left on the farther bank, I fled. This made him more eager to chase me, and since I was naked, I must have appeared more for the taking. The faster I ran, the hotter the river god pressed on the trail, as doves will flee from a menacing hawk on their fluttering wings, and the menacing hawk will fly on the tail of the fluttering dove. I ran as far as Orchomenus, Sophus, and on to Cyllene, across the valleys of Maenalis, cold Erymanthus, and Elis. I kept on running, so hard that Alpheus could never catch up. But I was less strong than he was and couldn't survive such a lengthy pursuit. His endurance was greater. Still, over the plains and tree-covered mountains, the rocks and the cliffs, and places without any tracks, I continued to run. The sun was behind me. I saw a long shadow looming in front of my feet, unless it was terror that saw it. At least I could hear the frightening sound of his pounding footsteps and feel the blasts of his panting breath on the ends of my hairbands. Overcome by the effort of running, I cried to Diana, "Help, I am caught, your own dear nymph who carried your weapons, to whom you so often entrusted your bow and quiver of arrows." The heart of the goddess was stirred. She brought down one of the clouds and threw it around me. No sooner had I been enshrouded in mist than the river god prowled and searched in bafflement round the cloud. Twice he unknowingly circled the spot where the goddess had hidden me. Twice he called out, "Arethusa, my love, Arethusa, where are you? How do you think I felt? Like a lamb on hearing the howling of wolves by the fence of the fold, or a cowering hare in a thorn bush watching the dogs' fierce muzzles, not daring to make any movement?" Alpheus remained where he was. There weren't any footprints leading onwards, and so he concentrated his eyes on the cloud. Cold sweat poured down my beleaguered limbs, and the blue-tinged drops steamed over my body. I moved my foot, and a pool seeped out. My hair was dripping with moisture, and faster than I can describe it, I changed into water. But now the river god saw that the stream was the nymph that he'd loved. He dropped the human guise he'd assumed and reverted to water in order to be united with me. Diana quickly created a cleft in the earth, and I plunged down through its murky recesses until I arrived at Ortygia, isle that I love, called after my patron Diana, and first to welcome me back to the upper air in Syracuse harbor. Arethusa's story was ended. The goddess of all the crops now harnessed her twin snakes onto her chariot, fastened their bridles, and launched herself through the air between the sky and the earth, till she brought her flying car down in the city of Pallas Athena. Here she handed it over to young Triptolemus's charge, with orders to sow the seeds that she gave him, partly in soil which had never been tilled, and partly in fields which had long lain fallow. Triptolemus then took off and soared over Europe and Asia, until he landed on Scythian soil, where the ruler was Lyncus, whose palace he entered. Asked where he came from, his reason for coming, his name, and his country, he answered, "My country is far-famed Athens. My name is Triptolemus. As for my coming, it wasn't by ship, or on foot, over land. I traveled instead through the open sky. I am bringing you gifts from Ceres. Now scatter these seeds all over your fields and to return you a fat, fruitful harvest of nourishing food." The barbarian king was filled with envy. He wanted the credit himself for this marvelous gift, so he welcomed Triptolemus under his roof, and, once his guest was asleep, he crept to his bedside, dagger in hand. As he raised his weapon to stab him, Ceres turned him to a lynx and commanded the youth from Athens to drive his sacred chariot team once more through the air. Our leader Calliope here ended her brilliant recital, went on the Muse, who was telling Minerva about the contest. The nymphs were agreed in their verdict. The victory should go to Helicon's Muses. The losers responded by raining abuse. "So it isn't enough," I then interposed, "that your challenge has won you a trouncing? No, it appears that you feel the need to add insult to injury. Since, moreover, our patience has come to an end, we had better follow the course which our anger dictates, and proceed to punish you." All that the 9 Pierides did was to laugh and make light of my threatening words. As they tried to continue their shouting and screaming, and brandish their fists, they suddenly noticed that feathers were sprouting out of their nails, and their arms were growing a cover of plumage. Looking at one another, they saw hard beaks stiffen out of their faces. A novel species of bird was joining the forest. Wanting to beat their breasts, they flapped their arms and were lifted into the air, where they hovered, the scolds of the woodlands, magpies. Even today they preserve their original gift of the gab as raucous, chattering birds with a limitless passion for talking.